Chapter 1. The ghost of the past London was wrapped in an autumnal fog, as if in a shroud. The narrow streets, dimly lit by the faint glow of gas lamps, seemed like a labyrinth woven from shadows and whispers. In the house at 221B, Baker Street, however, the usual calm reigned, interrupted only by the crackling of logs in the fireplace and the creaking of a pen in Sherlock Holmes's hand. "Do you believe in ghosts, Watson?" he suddenly asked, without looking up from the letter he was carefully examining. "After all the cases we've unraveled?" I chuckled, putting down the newspaper. "Ghosts are for superstitious maids, Holmes. What if I told you one of them is sitting right across from you?" He raised his eyes, and a spark of excitement flickered in their grey depths. Before I could respond, a sharp knock on the door interrupted our conversation. On the threshold stood a newsboy, trembling from the cold and clearly frightened. In his hands, he clutched an envelope sealed with black wax. "For Mr. Holmes," he whispered, as if afraid the walls would hear him. "From a man without a face." Holmes slowly opened the letter. I noticed how his shoulders tensed as he scanned the lines. "What is it?" I asked, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. "An old acquaintance," he handed me the sheet. "Sherlock, do you remember Reichenbach?" "I don't. But my apprentice is eager to replay that game. Find the black box on Waterloo Bridge. You have until midnight. The game begins." It's impossible," I breathed. "Moriarty is dead. We saw his body." "The body, Watson," Holmes stood, throwing on his coat. "But genius, like a virus, mutates. Someone has taken up his legacy and now wants to play our game." We stepped out into the night, cold and damp. London seemed to hold its breath. On Waterloo Bridge, the wind howled like an organ in an empty church. Without slowing his pace, Holmes headed toward the parapet, where a small black box lay on the stones. "Careful," I warned, noticing a thin wire running from the lock to the wall. "A trap?" "No," Holmes smirked. "An invitation." He took out a pocket knife, carefully cut the wire, and opened the lid. Inside lay a key engraved with a snake biting its own tail, and a note: "The first move is made. The next, at the Globe's Theatre, where the king lost his crown. P.S. Don't forget the violin. Your old friend." "The Globe Theatre?" I frowned. "It's been closed for 10 years. That's why it's perfect." Holmes turned the key in his hands. "The Ouroboros, the symbol of eternal return. Our apprentice wants us to remember the past." "You think it's a trap?" "Without a doubt. But it has style." Moriarty loved theatrical gestures. When we arrived at the Globe, the building looked ominous, windows boarded up, and above the entrance hung a cracked sign with the image of a crown. Holmes inserted the key into the lock, and the door creaked open. "Strange," he murmured, lighting a match. "The smell. Familiar. Gunpowder?" I sniffed. "No. Blood." Suddenly, somewhere deep inside the building, the sound of a violin began to play, the very melody Moriarty had danced to before falling at Reichenbach. Holmes sharply turned, his eyes narrowing. "He's here, Watson. And he's waiting." We moved toward the sound but stopped abruptly. On the floor, in a pool of moonlight, lay a corpse. A man in evening attire, with a golden crown on his head. His face was distorted with horror, and a black feathered arrow protruded from his chest. "King Lear," Holmes stated, examining the body. "The performance that never happened." "But why?" I struggled to suppress a shiver. "This isn't just a murder, Watson. It's a challenge. A game of cat and mouse, where we are the mice." He bent down to retrieve the arrow, but at that moment the violin fell silent, and from behind the curtains came laughter, cold, devoid of joy. "You have 3 hours until midnight, Mr. Holmes, a voice echoed in the darkness. Will you solve the second part of the puzzle in time? Chapter 2. The spiral of Ouroboros the next morning brought an unexpected ray of sunlight piercing through London's gloom. At 221B, Holmes sat at the table, carefully examining the black-feathered arrow found at the Globe Theatre. His fingers slowly traced the barely visible notches along the shaft. "Watson, look," he suddenly said, pointing to the symbols. "These aren't just decorations. They're African writings, the language of the Night tribe, mentioned by Professor Milbank." "Do you think the arrow is connected to the same curse?" I asked, stepping closer. "No," Holmes shook his head. "It's a message. Each symbol here is part of a map." He pulled out the yellowed notes of Milbank, which we had taken from his estate. Comparing the notches on the arrow with the diagrams in the diary, he continued, "The Ouroboros, the snake biting its tail. In the theatre where Lord Blackwell was killed, there's a secret passage in the basement. The symbol points to it. So that's where we should go?" "Exactly. But first," Holmes raised a finger, "we need to understand who's behind this. Moriarty's apprentice wouldn't act alone. The mystery of the underground." We returned to the Globe Theatre, now equipped with lanterns and tools for investigation. In the basement, accessed through a hidden door behind a tapestry depicting King Lear, the air smelled of dampness and mold. The walls were covered with strange signs resembling those we'd seen on the arrow. "Look," Holmes whispered, directing the lantern's beam to the floor. "Footprints. Not just human ones." In the dust were prints of rat paws, but among them stood out the clear imprint of a boot with a rare sole pattern. "It's the same person who was at Milbank's estate," Holmes concluded. "He leaves clues like an artist signing a canvas." We moved along the tunnel, which, judging by the thick layer of dust, hadn't been used for decades. Suddenly, Holmes stopped, pointing to a niche in the wall. "Watson, there's something here." In the niche lay an old medallion engraved with the Ouroboros. Holmes picked it up, and at that moment, somewhere in the darkness, a creak sounded, as if a door had opened on rusty hinges. A game of hide-and-seek, we moved toward the sound, but the tunnel branched like the roots of an ancient tree. Holmes seemed certain of the direction. He walked like a hunter sensing prey. Suddenly, the lantern caught the silhouette of a cloaked figure. It flashed around a corner, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. "Stop!" I shouted, but Holmes gestured for me to be silent. "No need to scare off the prey, Watson. He wants us to follow him." We cautiously moved forward until we found ourselves in a small stone room. Shards of glass and old newspapers lay scattered on the floor. Holmes picked up a sheet dated 1889, an article about the theft of artifacts from the British Museum. "Colonel Aileron," he muttered. "That's where I've seen this handwriting." "Colonel? But he's dead?" Holmes smirked. "Or just hiding." The key to the mystery back at Baker Street, Holmes immediately immersed himself in the archives. "Aileron didn't die, Watson. He faked his death after the Moriarty case to escape justice. Now he's back to finish what he started." "But why does he need the arrow?" "Not the arrow. The power he attributes to artifacts. He believes they grant control over life and death." At that moment, there was a knock on the door. A young woman in mourning attire stood on the threshold, her face hidden by a veil. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling, I'm Professor Milbank's daughter. Father wrote about the curse, but it's not mysticism. It's a cipher." Holmes stood, his eyes gleaming. "Do you know where the key to his diary is hidden?" "Yes. At the Victoria and Albert Museum. Exhibit 42, the Sun God statuette." The museum artifact. The museum greeted us with silence, broken only by the footsteps of the guards. Exhibit 42, a small obsidian statuette, stood in the corner of the hall dedicated to African cultures. Holmes, ignoring the labels, took out a magnifying glass. Look, he said, pointing to the base of the statue. The same Ouroboros symbol. Under the statue, we found a hidden compartment containing a letter addressed to Milbank. The curse is a lie. But those who believe in it become its slaves. Save Lucienne. Lucienne? I asked. Milbank's daughter. She's in danger. Holmes clenched the letter in his hand. Aelron is using her as bait. He wants us to come to Reichenbach. The trap at Reichenbach Falls, the site of Holmes's final battle with Moriarty, greeted us with the roar of water and a cold wind. On the edge of the cliff stood Aelron, holding Lucienne by the hand. In his other hand gleamed the black feathered arrow. Holmes! He shouted. You've come after all. Release her, Aelron. Your game is over. A game? He laughed. This is just the beginning. You destroyed Moriarty, but his teachings live on. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cold. You're no Moriarty. You're a pitiful parody. Am I? Aelron raised the arrow. Then why are you here? Why didn't you stop me sooner? Suddenly, Lucienne broke free and ran. Distracted, Aelron swung the arrow, but Holmes, using his cane, knocked it out of his hand. Time's up, Aelron, he said, as I helped the fallen girl to her feet. Chapter 3. The Ouroboros Code. It was late morning by the time Sherlock Holmes and I concluded our initial survey of Lower Cranston's shadowed corridors and hushed rooms. The mood among the staff had grown no less tense. Servants moved with hurried steps, glancing over their shoulders at each squeak of a floorboard or distant footfall. I could see plainly that fear lingered in every corner, fanned by whispered rumors of a curse. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated by the mystery. His keen eyes roamed ceaselessly, alighting upon the smallest detail, a scrap of mud on the stair runner, a scuff mark upon a seldom-used door, and all the while he maintained an air of cool detachment. I had seen this aspect of him many times before, an almost inhuman focus that allowed him to sift truths from the most confounding circumstances. Shortly after noon, we found ourselves in a modest sitting room used by the staff on their breaks. Mrs. Farham had arranged for the frightened maid, Betty, to meet us there. Betty was a slight, nervous girl, her apron crumpled from twisting it in her hands, and her eyes were red from tears. She kept glancing at the doorway as if expecting some dreadful figure to appear at any moment. Have no fear, my dear, I said gently, hoping to put her at ease. Mr. Holmes and I merely wish to understand what you saw last evening. She nodded, though her voice trembled when she spoke. It was near dusk, sir. I was feeding scraps to the stray cat that lingers by the kitchen door when I caught sight of something. A shape, like a tall man, standing by the edge of the gardens. I couldn't see his face, but I heard a low sound, almost like chanting, though I couldn't make out the words. Holmes leaned forward, his gaze intent. A tall man, you say? Was there anything else distinctive about this figure, his clothing, his posture? Betty's cheeks paled. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, or so I thought, and a long coat that seemed to swallow him up. She paused, shivering. I know it sounds silly, but I thought he was holding something in his hand. A long stick, or perhaps... Her voice fell to a whisper. Perhaps a spear. At that pronouncement, my pulse gave a small jump. Though I do not favor superstitions, the notion of the ebony spear being carried through the grounds at dusk was enough to send a chill along my spine. Holmes rubbed his chin thoughtfully. And you were certain of what you saw? Betty glanced down. I cannot say with utter certainty, sir. The light was poor, and I was frightened. But I know I saw a figure near the hedge maze. Looming there one moment, then he vanished into the mist. Holmes thanked her for her time and gently recommended she go about her duties, assuring her we would delve deeper into the matter. When she left, he stared pensively at the empty seat where she had been. Well, Watson, what do you make of it? He asked at length. An intruder, perhaps, I ventured. Someone skulking about the estate with motives yet unknown. Colonel Aileron, if we accept Mr. Colby's story of their rivalry, might fit the description. He could well be searching for the spear, especially if he deems it valuable. Holmes nodded but did not confirm or deny the suggestion outright. Instead, he rose abruptly. I see no reason to remain idle. Let us speak with Colonel Aileron himself. Mr. Colby did mention the man had been lodging at the local inn, though absent these past few days. Perhaps the proprietor can enlighten us. Thus, we set out on foot to the nearby village, which lay half an hour's brisk walk from Lower Cranston. The autumn sun overhead did little to dispel the sense of foreboding that pressed upon my mind. The fields were quiet, and a breeze rustled through the last of the brown leaves, scattering them across our path. We arrived at the village to find a quaint street of shops and a small church spire rising beyond them. A sign bearing the words "The King's Horn" marked a cozy public house, its doorway flanked by flower boxes now wilted by the cool weather. Inside, the landlord greeted us cheerily at first, though his expression sobered when Holmes inquired about Colonel Aileron. "Ah, yes," sighed the landlord, a stout man with a mop of curly grey hair. "The Colonel, he kept a room here for near a fortnight, paid handsomely he did. But I've not clapped eyes on him these 3 days. Packed up in a hurry, I'd wager, left before dawn, if the scullery lad is to be believed." Holmes pressed for details. Had the Colonel said where he might be headed, or the reason for his abrupt departure? The landlord, wiping at the bar with a rag, shrugged. He was in high dudgeon the night before, muttering under his breath about that blasted relic, and how it should have been his. Drank more than was his custom, if you take my meaning. Next thing I know, he's vanished. My friend's features tightened with interest. Did he happen to mention the ebony spear by name? The landlord's eyes widened slightly. Indeed he did, sir. Said the professor had no business claiming it, that it rightfully belonged to him. Something about the professor not understanding the artifact's true significance. Holmes gave a low hum of comprehension. I see. My thanks for your assistance. Should the Colonel return, please to let us know at once. Stepping back into the crisp air, Holmes and I exchanged a contemplative look. One suspect with a known quarrel over the spear. I mused, yet the man disappears. It is all rather suspicious. Holmes nodded in agreement. Indeed, Watson. But I suspect Colonel Aileron is not the sole piece in this intricate puzzle. Recall the professor's notes, mention of a tribal guardian or curse. It may well be that the Colonel sought the spear for his own ends, yet there could be another party equally determined. Our return to the estate was punctuated by an unsettling discovery. As we were crossing the lawn, we saw a group of servants gathered near the garden hedge, whispering anxiously. At our approach, they parted to reveal another man, a gardener, by his attire, holding up a small scrap of cloth, dark with mud. It bore the unmistakable greenish hue of the local inn's livery. Found it snagged on a thorn bush, the gardener muttered, eyeing Holmes with a mixture of weariness and hope. I recognized the color, the chap from the inn wears coats like these. Holmes examined the cloth, nodding slowly. Most intriguing. Colonel Aileron may have been here last night, lurking by the hedge, or so it would appear. Before I could voice my thoughts, a commotion from the direction of the house startled us. Mrs. Farham, out of breath, came rushing across the lawn, skirts gathered about her. Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson. You must come at once. Something has happened in the professor's study. Fearing the worst, we followed her swift strides back into the house. There, in the dim hush of the study, we found Mr. Colby wringing his hands as he stood beside the professor's desk. The drawers had been pulled open, and certain papers scattered on the floor. Notably, the locked chest, previously unopened, was now forced wide, its lid splintered where a crowbar had evidently been applied. It appears someone broke in, Colby gasped, his face ashen. I had stepped away but 10 minutes. One of the footmen reported hearing a crash, and when we arrived, he gestured helplessly to the scene of disarray. I fear crucial evidence has been taken, though I cannot determine what was inside. Holmes knelt by the chest, running his fingertips along the jagged break. A most direct intrusion. The culprit possessed either great determination or desperation. He glanced at the scattered papers. Were these the professor's private correspondences about the spear? Colby nodded. Yes, some. But I have no idea what else might have been here. The professor was secretive about certain acquisitions, that could be letters, sketches, or something more specific to the ebony spear's origin. I saw Holmes's gaze turn thoughtful. Another step in this relentless pursuit. The question remains, who took these documents, and for what purpose? He stood, brushing dust from his knees. We must not overlook the possibility that the colonel is not acting alone, or that an entirely different party is at play. At that moment, the butler Andrew stepped in, clearing his throat. Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but the staff is quite alarmed. They wonder if more mischief is at hand. Holmes turned his grey eyes, steely with resolve. There is mischief indeed, Andrews. But I would urge everyone to remain calm. Dr. Watson and I intend to uncover the truth. He paused, glancing at the shattered chest once more. Above all, let no one attempt to move the ebony spear from its display, nor meddle with anything further. That relic may be the heart of this puzzle, and we cannot afford to lose sight of it. With that final pronouncement, Sherlock Holmes fixed his attention on the torn papers and battered chest, every sense of his mind bent on unraveling the forces conspiring around the ill-omened ebony spear. As I stood by his side, I felt the weight of Lower Cranston's disquiet more keenly than ever. Dark secrets and fervid ambition had converged upon this estate, and I feared there would be no peace until Holmes's brilliant deductions cast a revealing light upon every hidden corner. Holmes pointed to the wall, where a map of London marked with snake symbols hung. Macula doesn't want the spear. He wants us to believe it's important. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed, a section of the wall slid open, revealing a passage. Forward! Holmes commanded. We rushed through the passage, but beyond it lay only an empty room with a single object, an ancient mirror framed in blackwood. Its surface shimmered with the same symbols as the spear. The mirror. Holmes touched the glass. It's no mere decoration. It's a portal. A portal? For the mind. Macula is playing with our fears. At that moment, the mirror darkened, and an image appeared, Lucy, alive, standing in the center of a labyrinth of mirrors, her face distorted with anguish. Chapter 4. Mirrors of Truth. Waterloo Bridge, where we first discovered the box with the Ouroboros symbol, now seemed even more ominous. The fog had thickened, as if nature itself was hiding the truth from us. Holmes, despite the wound he sustained in the skirmish with Elron, walked with the determination of a man who knows he is close to solving the mystery. Watson, he suddenly said, stopping by the parapet, we were wrong. Macula doesn't want to return the spear. He wants to complete the ritual that Moriarty began. A ritual? I asked, feeling the cold seep into my bones. You think it's connected to African cults? Exactly. Remember the map from the museum? It doesn't indicate locations but time. Each symbol represents a phase of the moon. Elron was just a pawn, as was Lucy. At that moment, I noticed Holmes clutching the medallion Emily Milbank had given him. His fingers trembled, a rare sign of agitation. Macula uses fear to break us. But his weakness is mirrors. Mirrors? Yes. In the legends of the Night Serpent tribe, mirrors serve as portals for spirits. Those who saw themselves in them lost their minds. We returned to Baker Street, where Emily was waiting for us. Her usually pale face now glowed with resolve. Mr. Holmes, she said, I must confess. Macula. He's not just a guardian. He's my uncle. Holmes nodded, as if he had expected this. You knew? I asked, surprised. I suspected. Your story about Lucy's disappearance, Milbank's letters. Everything fits. Macula returned to avenge his tribe. But how is he connected to Aileron? I asked. Aileron was his apprentice, Emily interjected. He believed in the curse of the spear, but Uncle Macula saw it only as a tool. A tool for what? I pressed. For opening a portal, Holmes pointed to the medallion. Mirrors, symbols, lunar cycles. He wants to bring something back from the past. Emily lowered her eyes. He wants to restore the covenant, the pact between the tribe and the spirits. Professor Milbank stole it along with the spear. Holmes, not wasting time, sent us to an old mansion on the outskirts of London, where, according to Emily, Macula kept his final clues. The building, abandoned long before Moriarty's time, stood like a mausoleum, its windows boarded up. Watson, take the lantern, Holmes whispered. And be ready for surprises. We entered through a breach in the wall. Inside reigned a dusty silence, broken only by the creak of floorboards. Suddenly, the lantern illuminated a strange gleam, a whole wall lined with mirrors. Their surfaces were cracked, but in each one our silhouettes were distorted beyond recognition. It's a trap, Holmes muttered. He wants us to see what isn't there. What do you mean? The mirrors show not reality, but fears. Look carefully. I peered into the nearest mirror and shuddered. I saw Lucy tied to an altar, and behind her, the shadow of Moriarty. These are illusions, Watson. Macula manipulates our memories. Suddenly, the mirrors trembled, and from the depths of the house came Macula's voice. You've come, Holmes. But can you bear the truth? Truth has no patience for cowards, Holmes replied, slowly stepping forward. We passed through the mirror maze until we found ourselves in a circular hall where an ancient altar stood. On it lay the covenant, a scroll covered in symbols of the night serpent tribe. Stop! Emily cried. It's a trap. But Holmes had already stepped toward the altar. At that moment, the mirrors came alive, and from them emerged shadows, dozens of people whose faces were distorted with horror. These are those who broke the covenant, Macula explained, emerging from the shadows. Their souls are trapped between worlds forever. Do you want to free them? Holmes asked. No. I want you to take their place. Macula raised his hand, and the mirrors began to vibrate. Time's up, Holmes, Macula hissed. The spear is just the key. The true power lies in the covenant. Holmes, without answering, threw the medallion onto the altar. It struck the scroll, and the mirrors suddenly darkened. What have you done? Emily exclaimed. I solved your game, Holmes smirked. The medallion is not a talisman but an antidote. Moriarty left it to protect London. Macula growled, and at that moment, the mirrors shattered into pieces. From the shards rose a whirlwind, carrying the covenant away with it. This isn't over. Macula shouted, disappearing into the mist. Holmes, wounded but triumphant, turned to me. He'll return, Watson. But now we have the answer. Chapter 5. The Underground Code. After discovering the underground passage at Lower Cranston, Holmes, despite his wound, insisted on immediate exploration. We stood at the entrance to the tunnel, illuminated only by the dim light of lanterns. Watson, Holmes whispered, pointing to the ground, do you see these tracks? 2 sets, one from Alaron's boots, the other, bare feet. Lucy is here. But how? I asked, feeling the cold seep through my coat. Even if she's alive, why wasn't she found earlier? Because Macula didn't want her to be found. He used the servant's fear to cover his tracks. We descended the stairs, their steps slick with mold. The air smelled of decay and dampness, and the walls were covered with the same symbols as those on the spear. These are the writings of the Night Serpent tribe, Holmes explained. They describe a ritual. The blood of the innocent is the key to the spirit world. Do you think Lucy is part of this ritual? Yes. But Macula overlooked one thing: I won't let him repeat Moriarty's mistakes. Deep in the tunnel, we stumbled upon a small chamber cluttered with old crates. Shards of glass and yellowed maps lay scattered on the floor. Holmes, ignoring the dampness, knelt down. "Look, Watson," he said, holding up a fragment of a clay tablet with carved symbols. "These aren't just drawings. They're equations. Moriarty studied them before his death." "Equations?" I repeated, leaning closer. "Yes." He tried to link them to astronomical calculations. Macula, it seems, completed his work. At that moment, the lantern illuminated an old journal belonging to Milbank. Holmes quickly flipped through the pages, his fingers stopping at an entry, November, 1892. Macula warned me, the spear must not leave its homeland. But I couldn't leave it behind. The temptation to understand how ancient tribes wielded fear was too great. He knew it was dangerous, Holmes muttered. But his greed overcame him. We pressed on until the tunnel widened into a hall with a high ceiling. In the center stood a cracked stone altar, and masks hung on the walls, similar to those we'd seen in Milbank's collection. Rituals were conducted here. Holmes examined the masks. But Macula altered them. Instead of prayers, violence. Suddenly, a rustle sounded. A cloaked figure emerged from the shadows. "You're too clever, Holmes," Macula hissed. "But even you can't stop the ritual." "Where's Lucy?" I demanded, gripping my revolver. "Safe. For now." Holmes, despite his injury, stepped forward. "You don't understand, Macula. The spear is just a symbol. The power lies in the fear you sow." "A symbol?" Macula laughed. "You're blind, like Milbank. It's the key to a power you can't even imagine." He tossed a scroll onto the altar. "Read it. These are Moriarty's final notes. He sought this power too." Holmes picked up the scroll, his eyes narrowing. "Lies. Moriarty never believed in curses. He played with them, just as you do." Back at the house, Holmes immediately immersed himself in studying the scroll. "Watson," he said without looking up, "this isn't just a ritual. It's a mathematical model. Moriarty tried to turn mysticism into science." "But how?" At that moment, Emily burst through the door, her face contorted with fear. "Mr. Holmes. Lucy. She's in the chapel. Macula is preparing the ritual." "How did you find out?" I asked. He confessed to me. I was supposed to be next." Holmes grabbed the lantern. "Then let's go. But be careful, Macula is waiting for us." We rushed to the chapel, but at the entrance a trap awaited us. The door slammed shut, locking Emily outside. "This isn't Macula." Holmes inspected the lock. "Aileron. He's alive. But we saw his body." "Macula faked his death. He's been manipulating us from the start." Inside the chapel, candles burned, and Lucy lay unconscious and bound on the altar. Beside her stood Aileron, holding the spear. "Welcome, Holmes," Aileron sneered. "You missed the finale." "The finale?" Holmes slowly approached. "You're merely repeating Moriarty's mistakes." "Mistakes?" Aileron drove the spear into the ground. "This is rebirth." At that moment, the mirrors on the walls came alive, reflecting dozens of copies of Aileron. "You won't defeat me!" Aileron shouted, his voice echoing through the mirrors. "The spear will unite the worlds." Holmes, without responding, threw the medallion at him. It struck the spear, and the mirrors suddenly cracked. Moriarty left this to protect London, Holmes said. You're just his shadow. Elron, growling, lunged at him. I fired, but the bullet ricocheted off the stone altar. Run, Watson! Holmes shouted, dodging the attack. Save Lucy! At that moment, the ground trembled, and mist rose from cracks in the floor, reminiscent of the fog around Reichenbach. Too late, Macula hissed, emerging from the mist. The ritual is complete. Chapter 6. The trap in the shadows. After Macula disappeared into the mist near the waterfall, Holmes and I returned to our home on Baker Street. His wound from the spear was bleeding, but as always, he ignored the pain. Watson, he said, lowering himself into his chair, Macula isn't dead. He's far too clever for that. But how did he survive the fall? I asked, bandaging his shoulder. He didn't fall. It was an illusion, created by the mirrors. He wants us to believe he's dead. Then what's next? We must find the connection between him and Moriarty. Emily Milbank is the key. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Emily stood on the threshold, her face pale but resolute. Mr. Holmes, she said, I need to show you something. Something my grandfather left behind. Emily pulled an old leather-bound journal from her bag. On the cover was a faded inscription, for Emily. Truth is more important than legends. Grandfather. He wrote this knowing I'd find it, her voice trembled. But I don't understand. Holmes took the journal, his fingers pausing on a page with a drawing of the Ouroboros serpent. Look, Watson. Moriarty left a cipher. These symbols aren't just drawings. They're coordinates. Coordinates for what? A place where the Night Serpent tribe keeps their secrets. Macula is searching for it to complete the ritual. Emily suddenly clenched her hands. But if that's true, then he'll go to the London archive. That's where the maps tied to my grandfather's expeditions are stored. That's where we'll head. Holmes stood, ignoring his wound. But first. He didn't finish. A shadow resembling a cloaked figure flickered past the window. The London archive greeted us with silence, broken only by the rustle of ancient scrolls. Without even glancing at the catalogue, Holmes headed straight for the section marked African Expeditions, 1885 to 1890. Watson, see these cabinets? He asked, pointing to a row of metal drawers. Moriarty marked them as safe. But for what? Maybe maps of places linked to the tribe? Or something greater? Holmes opened one of the drawers. Inside were not maps, but glass ampules filled with black liquid. Each bore the engraving of a serpent. It's not blood, he muttered, holding an ampule to the light. Resin mixed with ash. The symbols on them. They match the cipher from Emily's journal. So Moriarty knew about the ritual? Yes. But he didn't believe in curses. He wanted to control them. Suddenly, a crash echoed from the corridor. We rushed out to find a shattered window. On the floor lay a stone with a note tied to it. Holmes, you're playing someone else's game. Stop while you still can. M. This isn't Macula. Holmes turned the note over in his hands. It's his accomplice. Who? I asked. Someone who knows our methods. Someone from the past. Emily, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. My grandfather mentioned a man. Someone who helped him in Africa. Dr. Renvold. Renvold? I repeated. But he died during the expedition. No, he didn't. Holmes narrowed his eyes. He faked his death. And now he wants to finish what Moriarty started. We rushed toward the exit, but in the doorway, we were met by a tall man in a black coat. His face was hidden behind a half-mask, but his eyes, those same cold, calculating eyes I'd seen in Moriarty's records. Dr. Renvald, Holmes stepped forward. Or do you now prefer to be called M? You're too clever, Holmes, he growled. But that won't save London. A knife flashed in his hand, but Holmes, grabbing an ampule from the table, threw it at Renvald. The glass shattered, and the black liquid soaked his coat. This is the tribe's ash, Holmes explained. It won't harm you, but it will ruin your game. Hissing, Renvald bolted. We chased him through the labyrinth of archive shelves until he disappeared into the basement. He's heading for the mirrors, Holmes said, where Moriarty conducted his experiments. The archive basement was filled with old mirrors, dozens reflecting our light in the darkness. In the center stood Renvald, holding the spear stolen from Lower Cranston. You don't understand, Holmes, he shouted. This isn't a curse. It's science. Moriarty understood how to control fear through symbols. I'll finish what he started. Fear isn't a weapon, Renvald. It's a weakness. He struck the mirror with the spear, and the room filled with echoes, as if hundreds of voices screamed at once. Watson, look out! Holmes shouted, pulling me aside. The mirrors began to tremble, their surfaces cracking. Laughing, Renvald dashed toward the exit. No, Watson, Holmes grabbed my sleeve. It's a trap. He wants us to follow him. But where is he going? To where it all began. To Reichenbach. Chapter 7. Moriarty's final cipher. After Renvald's arrest in the archive, Holmes and I returned to our home on Baker Street. His wound from the spear throbbed, but as always, he ignored the pain, immersing himself in studying the ampules of black resin we had found at Lower Cranston. Watson, he suddenly said, not looking up from the microscope, these ampules contain more than just ash. It's blood and ash, mixed according to an ancient recipe. You think it's part of the ritual? No. It's a key. Moriarty left them to confuse the trail. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Emily Milbank stood on the threshold, her face pale but resolute. Mr. Holmes, she said, something strange has happened at the estate. The mirrors. They've come alive. We immediately set off for Lower Cranston. Along the way, Emily explained that the mirrors in the house had begun showing illusions, servants saw ghosts, and scenes from the past appeared in the glass. This isn't mysticism, Holmes explained, examining a mirror in the library. Macula is using chemical vapors to create hallucinations. He wants us to believe in the curse. But why? I asked, feeling fear tighten my throat. To distract us from the real goal. Holmes pulled an ampule from his pocket and carefully applied its contents to the mirror. The surface darkened instantly, revealing a hidden symbol, a serpent biting its own tail. Ouroboros, he murmured. It leads us to the final cipher. Following the symbols, we descended into the basement, where we discovered an old secret passage hidden behind the stone masonry. Watson, remember the case of the underground tunnel beneath Baker Street? Holmes asked, lighting the way with a lantern. Macula has studied our methods. Do you think he's here? No. He's waiting for us at Reichenbach. The tunnel led to the river, where an old boat lay, the same one the fisherman from the village had mentioned. Inside it was a note, Holmes, you're close. But can you solve the final cipher? Look where 3 rivers meet. M. 3 rivers. I repeated. That's Reichenbach, Watson. Where I defeated Moriarty. We headed to Switzerland, where the Reichenbach Falls greeted us with thunderous noise and cold mist. Holmes, despite his wound, walked with the confidence of a man who knows he's close to solving the mystery. Look, Watson, he pointed to a stone slab at the edge of the chasm. Here, Moriarty left the final cipher. The same Ouroboros symbols from the ampules were visible on the slab. Holmes took Emily's medallion and pressed it against the stone. The symbols began to glow, forming a map. "What is it?" I asked. "The path to the true covenant. Macula wants to complete the ritual to avenge his tribe." Suddenly, a voice echoed from the mist, "You're too slow, Holmes." Macula stood at the edge of the chasm, his silhouette barely visible in the fog. In his hand, he clutched the spear, and shadows resembling serpents swirled around him. "So you've come," he hissed. "But it's too late." "No, Macula," Holmes stepped forward. "You're repeating Moriarty's mistakes." "Mistakes?" Macula laughed. "He was blind. I see the true power." Holmes suddenly threw the medallion into the abyss. "Moriarty left this to protect London. You're just his shadow." Macula growled and hurled the spear. Holmes dodged and pulled an ampule from his pocket, smashing it against the ground. The black liquid spilled over the symbols, and the shadows vanished. "End of the game, Macula," Holmes declared. "Your magic is just science." "Then die like him." Macula lunged at us, but Holmes, using his cane, knocked him off balance. Losing his footing, Macula plummeted into the abyss, taking the spear with him. "Is this the end?" I asked, peering down. "No, Watson," Holmes stood, his face pale. "This is only the beginning." He pointed to the stone where the Ouroboros symbols glowed again. "The Covenant is still here. And it's waiting." At that moment, a cloaked figure emerged from the mist, wearing a medallion around his neck. "Hello, Holmes," he said. "Did you think it was over?" "Moriarty?" I recoiled. "No, Watson," Holmes clenched his fist. "It's his brother. And he knows where the Covenant is hidden." Chapter 8. The shadow of the brother we stood frozen at the edge of the chasm, staring at the cloaked figure. His medallion, similar to the one that had belonged to Emily, glowed with a soft green light. "Moriarty! Alive?" I whispered, feeling a chill run down my spine. "No, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice tense. "This is James Moriarty Jr., of whom we only knew through rumors." The cloaked figure stepped forward, and the mist around him began to dissipate. His face was pale, and his eyes burned with cold calculation, just like his brother's. "Holmes," he said with a faint smirk, "you've always been too clever for your own good." "Why are you here?" Holmes asked, not taking his eyes off him. "To finish what my brother started. The spear is just the key. But the true power, it lies in the Covenant." Holmes, without wasting a moment, took a step forward. "Tell me about it." "What is it?" Moriarty Jr. smirked. "Do you really think I'll hand over all the cards?" "My brother underestimated you, but I won't make the same mistake. The Covenant is an ancient pact between the Night Whisper tribe and their spirits. It grants power over time and space. But why do you want it? To correct the mistakes of the past. To reclaim what was stolen from my brother. Revenge?" Holmes narrowed his eyes. "How banal. Revenge?" Moriarty Jr. laughed. "This isn't revenge. This is justice." He pulled an old scroll from his pocket, covered in Ouroboros symbols. "This document will show the way. But only to those who are worthy." "You are not worthy," Holmes said coldly. "Your brother thought the same." "And where is he now?" Moriarty Jr., hearing this, turned pale with rage. "How dare you speak of him?" He lunged forward, drawing a knife. Holmes, despite his injury, dodged and struck with his cane, knocking the weapon from his hand. "Watson, back!" he shouted as the mist around us began to thicken. The scroll in Moriarty Jr.'s hands began to glow, and shadows resembling serpents rose from the ground. "It's a trap!" I shouted, drawing my revolver. "No, Watson, these are illusions." They can't harm us. Without hesitation, Holmes rushed toward Moriarty Jr., trying to snatch the scroll. You don't understand, Moriarty Jr. hissed, retreating toward the edge of the chasm. The Covenant has already been activated. No, Holmes grabbed his arm. You're just a puppet, like Macula. At that moment, the ground beneath us trembled, and the waterfall froze, as if time itself had stopped. Look! I cried, pointing to the mirror-like surface of the water. Scenes from the past appeared, Moriarty, Aileron, Lucy in the dungeon. This isn't reality, Holmes said, turning to Moriarty Jr. This is your memory. No! He screamed, trying to break free. Holmes, seizing the moment, snatched the scroll and threw it into the waterfall. End of the game. The scroll disappeared into the water, and the shadows began to dissolve. Moriarty Jr., losing his support, collapsed to his knees. Do you think this is the end? He whispered, his voice trembling. Yes, Holmes replied. Without the Covenant, you are nothing. Moriarty Jr., without another word, vanished into the mist, leaving only the echo of his footsteps. Watson, Holmes said, gazing at the waterfall, this isn't the end. But we have one.